I now give the floor to Mr. Carlos Ruiz Massieu.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate this opportunity to brief the Security Council on this symbolic day in Colombia, dedicated each year to the victims of the armed conflict. They should always be at the center of our efforts to build peace in Colombia and elsewhere. I welcome the presence today of Minister of Foreign Affairs Luis Gilberto Murillo and express once again my appreciation for the continued support of the government of Colombia to the work of the verification mission. I also welcome today the participation of Ms. Marcela Sanchez from the NGO Colombia Diversa, which gives visibility to the impact of conflict on women and LGBTI persons and their important role as peace builders. I would also like to recognize the attendance today of Roberto Vidal, President of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and recognize his leadership into at this important moment of the jurisdiction. Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, Colombia has reached an important juncture in relation to its ambitions of implementing the 2016 peace agreement and of advancing its ongoing dialogue initiatives. As the Security Council was able to observe firsthand during its recent visit, there is a deep desire for peace in Colombia that extends from highest levels of government and state institutions across civil society and to vulnerable communities in the regions still afflicted by conflict. The key challenge for transforming that aspiration into reality is to channel the abundant political will and impressive drive of civil society into ever more tangible dividends of peace on the ground. This effort will require Colombians to overcome divisions in an effort that should unite them across the political spectrum based on a common interest in securing a peaceful future.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, the transitional justice system which was set forth in the agreement bears witness to the trust built by the parties at that time in order to resolve an armed conflict which has affected Colombia for almost half a century. The system has struck a sensitive balance which is fundamental to sustain in order to fulfill the principle of keeping the victims at the center and to bring about the so desired transition towards peace. As part of this system, the Truth Commission played a vital role in shedding light on the historical truth of the conflict, in addition to the mandate of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, which is focused on investigating the most emblematic and representative cases, as well as the patterns of most serious crimes associated with them, and sanctioning those responsible for these crimes. The SJP's responsibility is intrinsically related to the transition from a war situation to a peace situation. And this is a task which is of monumental importance, which requires focusing on multiple different elements, rigor which is expedited, as well as focusing on the rights of the victims, the legal security, and the process of reintegration, and those appearing before the jurisdiction, honoring the commitments acquired under the agreement. Autonomy and independence for decision-making have been key for the SJP in order to fulfill its mandate, and it has done it that way and will continue to do so. Its framework, moreover, is determined by the balance struck in the agreement by the parties in formalizing them in law. I'd like to commend the fact that the SJP is increasingly close to handing down its first sanctions, and the victims need this, and they need it without further delay. Given recent difficulties, I take this opportunity to echo the call of the Secretary General to all involved parties to create the best possible conditions so that this culminating moment, which has been so awaited, will take place through constructive dialogue in order to overcome obstacles and to find solutions within the framework of the agreement. Colombians have given us many examples of resolving conflict through dialogue, and I trust that this will not be an exception to the rule.
While thousands of former FARC-EP members who laid down their weapons in good faith have stood by their commitments as per the agreement, the need for concrete and sustainable progress in its implementation has become ever more pressing with time. In this regard, I recommend a better use of the architecture for the implementation of the agreement, including the Commission for the follow-up, promotion, and verification of the implementation of the final agreement, CCB. In addition, I call upon the government to finalize the legal instruments to allow the swift implementation of the comprehensive reintegration program, as well as the national reintegration system, in order to provide these men and women with certainty and consolidate their transition into civilian life. Security also constitutes a key component of the reintegration of the former combatants and continues to be of the utmost concern. Regrettably, 11 more ex-combatants have been killed since the last report was issued. And as the Security Council heard repeatedly during its recent visit, social leaders, as well as entire communities, particularly Indigenous and Afro Colombians, still suffer the full impact of persisting violence and the limited presence of state institutions in various regions. In my recent visits to Cauca, Valle del Cauca, and Norte de Santander, this call for security was a common plea from ethnic groups, local authorities, civil society, as well as the private sector. The election last month of a new Attorney General, Luz Adriana Camargo, provides an opportunity to investigate and prosecute with renewed vigor those responsible for crimes against former combatants and social leaders. I met recently with her, and I was encouraged that her immediate priorities include the strengthening of the Special Investigation Unit created by the agreement, as well as broader efforts to combat the criminal structures responsible for the violence. Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, the current bilateral ceasefires are a significant step forward in order to build trust in negotiations and to reduce violence in the country. However, they do not replace security policy in the state's hand, which are geared to providing protection and well-being for those communities that are affected by the conflict. To the contrary, these efforts must be complementary to each other. Many of these policies are contemplated in the agreement, such as, for example, the policy of dismantling armed groups or the government's defense policy with its focus on human security. I trust that there will be progress in implementing it without further delay. In a challenging context for the negotiating table, with some significant differences to resolve between the parties, the government and the National Liberation Army, the ELN, who will meet this week in Caracas, Venezuela. On this occasion, I hope that they will be able to evaluate implementation of what was agreed to date and take decisions in order to make progress on implementing the agenda agreed in the Mexico agreement. I trust that the parties, with firm support from the international community, will be able to overcome the difficulties of the current situation and that they will be able to reaffirm to Colombian society the National Bureau's commitment to reach definitive agreements with tangible benefits for the communities. Turning now to the dialogues between the government and the group known as the EMC, I urge the parties to remain focused on resolving their differences at the negotiating table. despite current difficulties. And they should do so taking into account the unique opportunity which exists right now in order to contribute to a different future. To achieve that, it is key that they build on progress achieved to date and that they provide clear demonstrations of their determination for peace. Any hostility vis-a-vis the civilian population sends the contrary message. It would erode the confidence built between parties and society, which would see it as evidence of condemnable acts of violence against the indigenous population in Cauca, or which led to this partial suspension of the ceasefire by the government.
A roadmap for dealing with some of the structural causes of conflict in Colombia was laid out in the first chapter of the Agreement on Rural Reform. It aims to resolve, amongst other matters, the historical inequities of land tenure that have endured for decades. Among its priorities are the distribution, formalization, and restitution of land, as well as the delivery of public goods and services to rural Colombia. While there is still a long way to go to meet the ambitious goals of the peace agreement, the Secretary General in his report recognizes significant increases in budget allocations and efforts of the current government to deliver land and resolve land-related conflicts. A continuous drive to implement these provisions, backed with substantial investments and the coordinated engagement of all relevant ministries and state institutions, is needed to overcome inequalities that have long fueled cycles of violence in the countryside. Similarly, the agreement's ethnic chapter and gender provisions seek to address the long-standing exclusion and disproportionate impact of the conflict on Indigenous and Afro Colombian communities, as well as on women and LGBTQ persons. I look forward to concrete results towards the goal of achieving 60% of implementation of the ethnic chapter by 2026. I also trust that the soon-to-be-launched National Action Plan for Security Council Resolution 1325 will help further the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in the country. It will be important to ensure overall coherence between the plan and the gender provisions of the agreement. Furthermore, the principles of the plan regarding women's participation and the crafting of agreements that account for the gender dimensions of conflict and peace building should be duly considered and reflected in ongoing dialogue initiatives with armed groups. Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, the visit by the Council in February was an expression of support for the creative and courageous efforts underway in Colombia. I am certain that the visit provided much-needed encouragement to all sectors of society to persevere in their struggle for peace. However difficult and demanding of patience, Colombia's decision to prioritize dialogue as a principal means to resolve conflicts sets the country apart as a model that is more relevant than ever in today's world. I trust that this Council will echo our calls to encourage all actors in Colombia to redouble their efforts to implement the 2016 peace agreement and to pursue dialogue as a way to further consolidate peace in the country. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Ruiz Massieu for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Marcela